Welcome,
Here.
Jennifer.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm
Good
so glad to
morning.
be here. All right, and let me go ahead and get my slides up.
Fantastic. So Jennifer joins us. She is the Deputy Director of this and State DEI Officer for the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Ohio Department of Administrative Services. So we appreciate her joining us this morning, and she's going to talk a little bit more about some equity concepts to consider in education. So thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And as you said, Judith, this is certainly a hot topic here. Not just the underlying concepts of equity, but we know if you've been following the news, this kind of idea about what is equity, what is not equity, what is diversity, what is it, and how is it being kind of taught, or how is it impacting our students, is a really hot topic right now here in Ohio, as well as across the country. So I'm excited to be here to kind of talk through some of that, and excited to take your questions as well as we go through. So let's go ahead and jump in. So today I want to talk about just understanding some of the concepts that here in Ohio, the Department of Education has used to define educational equity. So we're going to do some level setting. And we're going to talk a little bit about culture, and then how we talk about the concept of cultural responsiveness as it ties to equity, including some more recent kind of discussion around, what's kind of gone on through COVID and thinking about it in terms of health equity. And then also talking about what are some maybe individual and system barriers to educational equity. Now, this is a lot of information, and so I do plan on going quickly, but you do have the slides. And so if I happen, I'll let you know if I have to skip a slide. But if I do, just like the previous speaker said, if you have questions or comments or want to digest it later, totally here to help you do that. So it is quite a bit of content, but there's just so much to talk about in this area. So one thing that we like to do, and I know you will appreciate this being in the education space, is in all of our diversity, equity, inclusion trainings, we really like to get participants in the right mindset, and this idea of why are we talking about it, and kind of what's the pathway as we talk about it. And so we use the Peterson's developmental model, and we talk about the need for awareness. So having, the knowledge that you need to know something, right? And so if you don't have that knowledge, you have some sort of a blind spot in this space. And so we want to make sure that we are kind of cultivating that ability to gain awareness, and be able to have these psychologically safe spaces to figure out what are the things we don't know. What is it that we don't know as individuals, as organizations? What is it we don't know, and how do we explore that? And then once we figure that out, how do we then go about learning and questioning? And especially questioning if it involves, kind of talking with others and learning from others. How do we do that and maintain, again, a psychologically safe space for all? And then we know we have to practice intentional skills. So anything that you're going to learn about today, or any other type of DEI classes you've taken, you've probably realized that a lot of this stuff, especially when we talk about bias, is embedded in us. And so it takes really intentional practice. It takes us, we have to pull our kind of brain out of automatic pilot and really kind of focus. And it's hard. It's about asking ourselves, are we changing our systems? Are we looking at our culture? What are we doing? And that kind of stuff is hard. So it takes intentional practice. And then you'll appreciate this probably the most. We want to always maintain that positive attitude, and really this idea of growth mindset. We're continuous learners in this process of DEI. And it's so important that we kind of remind ourselves of that. We're never going to be experts. We will make mistakes, and it's okay as long as we, do so in a way that doesn't, harm others. And we approach it with a sense of, being humble, and again, maintaining that psychological safety. And so if you like this slide, please steal it and use it, if you are talking about any sort of equity issues. We just like to level set that way. So let's talk about defining educational equity. So one of my clients is the Ohio Department of Education, and they have been working really hard on issues of equity. Their state board, which is actually up for debate right now, passed a resolution around equity last summer, and the employees that work there are now working on kind of embedding it. It's also in their strategic plans and their whole child framework. This is all foundationally based on equity. So we've been helping them figure out, how do we actually do this? How do we operationalize it? How do we put it into practice? So I've been really excited to work with the Department of Education on this and want to commend them for being really leaders in this kind of thought process around equity. It's a hard time to be the leader, and they're having some internal struggle right now around that. I want to talk about a few key terms. So here at the state of Ohio, as state government, we have defined terms for all of our agencies that are, in government. So we all have a shared common language. So these are the definitions that I'm sharing with you now, our state definitions. And when we talk about diversity, what we're talking about is this idea of human variety. So getting outside of those, check boxes and those EEO categories, and the things that the federal government and other government asks us to collect on people. We're truly talking about human variety, and we are all diverse if you consider that definition. So more than just the things we can see and kind of perceive about one another, it's really about that internal, who are we and where did we come from, and our experiences. All of that really leads to a much richer idea of diversity. Inclusion is about taking that diversity in and strategically using it. So whether that be in an organization, in a classroom, in a community project, you are taking the great variety that the people involved are coming in or coming to the project with, and really strategically understanding it and using it to be included in how we come to an ultimate outcome. So it is more than just this kind of nice feeling, which is nice, about being, being part of something. It's really about being more strategic about how we are including individuals. These two words, equality and equity. So the way that we talk about equality at the state is that this is the thing that this is the outcome we're trying to get to, right? We want equality. And we have come to the awareness, right, that we do not have equality. Our governor has said that. He's asked us to find places where we have inequity and inequality happening, and he wants us to fix it. And so this idea, the state of being equal in rights, fairness, status, opportunity, right? So we're talking about, that's the line. Equity is the ability to move the resources for individuals and groups of people who have barriers that are put before them to get to that line. And so we have the ability to really give them the things that they need so that they can have the outcome that we are looking for, right? So think about it in this space of early education. You want each of the students to gain those skills to continue to grow and learn, to get to kindergarten, to, eventually move up to and get through the third grade. And we know that there's lots of things that happen in the third grade, right? So whatever your outcome is in this space, you're trying to get all of your students there. And, you're trying to move those resources, whether that be actual resources or whether that be, professionals or curriculum or opportunities. You're moving those in a way that will help those students, those programs, those teachers, whoever your group is, really be able to hit that line. We also here at the state, like I said, our governor is really asking us to push deeper. And so we have introduced the concept of justice because government is a system. And so all of us, all the different agencies, are part of this one system to serve Ohio citizens. And we have to work better together to do that. And so the governor has asked us to do that and really seek out where our system is producing inequity. So how is it that if we're working together, we have issues, and we call that justice. So really making the system be equal for all. And then lastly, institutional bias. I kind of touched on that. This internal look in our organizations and really saying, where are these hidden barriers? What are we even doing to ourselves, right? What is the what is the, the thing we just always do? And maybe we need to really examine that and making sure that we aren't creating the hidden barriers to the outcome. And so these are concepts, these are big concepts that we at the state are really embracing, and each of our agencies, including the Department of Education, is working on. So here's Ohio's vision to advance equity, and you see all those words I kind of mentioned to you, but this one here, resilience. So the governor has also asked us to really try to embed this into culture. So really a culture shift and creating a space where, when we get a new administration or a new leader or a new something, this stuff doesn't go away, that it's still part of how we do business every day, because it's really just a best practice. And so that's what that resilience is. And this diagram is from the Kirwan, we stole it from the Kirwan Institute. I believe it's out there lots of places for the study of race and ethnicity at the Ohio State University. And it just kind of is another depiction. I'm sure you've seen it. There's also one with trees. And there's a whole bunch of other ones where this kind of depiction of difference between equality, equity, and like looking at outcome versus resource. So we would say that this is equity getting us to an equality of outcome, if the outcome is for them all to see over the fence, right? So not equality of resources, equality of outcome. But really what we're trying to do is figure out, why do we even need the fence? Right? And really be able to get in there and figure out in our systems what is creating the inequity. So the Ohio Department of Education has introduced the Each Child, Our Future as its strategic plan. It goes from 2019 to 2020. And as part of their strategic plan, they really have adopted and embraced the idea of the whole child. And the child at the center is foundationally an equity plan, right? Because you're looking at, what does the individual child need to be successful? And so they have a whole bunch of things around it, including each of these little circles is more detailed in the plan, but talking about, core principles, priorities, learning domains. And then we have even things around like community and parents, and how does all that fit together? This little apple right here, that is one of the core principles, and this is actually the principle of equity. So it is not only built foundationally on the whole child, but they spell it out as one of the 3 core principles of the plan. And so this means that, in the K-12 space here in public education, they are asking all of the public institutions here in Ohio, and those that want to follow along as well, to really embrace these and think about our children in this manner. I'm going to play you this video. This is actually from the Department of Education when they announced the whole child framework. It is the superintendent who will be speaking, and he is actually transitioning out of this role now. He's retiring. But I just thought, let them tell you in their own words what this is all about. Now, I hit the button to share my sound, so I know someone will let me know if that was unsuccessful. So let's go ahead and watch this video from the Ohio Department of Education.
In Ohio's 5-year strategic plan for education, Each Child, Our Future, the concept of the whole child is front and center. While developing the plan, we heard time and time again across the state that a great education is only possible if we, as a community, collaborate to meet the needs of the whole child. In fact, in the strategic plan, Strategy 7 focuses on just that, meeting the needs of the whole child. But what does that really mean, meeting the needs of the whole child? It means that for a child to succeed in school, in learning, that child can't have an empty stomach. That child can't be physically sick or suffering from mental trauma. That child can't be bullied. That child can't feel unsafe. That child can't feel disconnected from adults or not cared about by their community. Schools have always been places that engage in more than just academic learning. A school is a social system, people interacting with each other, and people taking care of each other, and people taking care of children. If a child's basic needs aren't addressed, then our efforts to ensure a student gains the academic knowledge and skills they need to succeed can't be effective. And while schools have always understood the concept of meeting the needs of the whole child, we heard over and over the need for a common language and common understanding of what taking care of the whole child really means. And right now, meeting the needs of the whole child is more important than ever. The COVID-19 pandemic has been hard on Ohio citizens, but in particular on Ohio's children. Access to healthy food, physical and mental health care, remote learning, and financial support have all been impacted. Social activities vital to the healthy development of young people have shifted and in many cases disappeared completely. With many schools operating remotely or in a remote in-person blended schedule, the safety nets that our education system usually is able to provide become drastically less accessible. All students, especially those most vulnerable, need support and guidance as they work to cope with the effects of the pandemic. That's why I am so pleased to announce the release of Ohio's Whole Child Framework, carefully crafted over a 10-month period by Ohio educators, counselors, and content experts in various fields, including mental and behavioral health, family engagement, social emotional learning, child nutrition, and services for vulnerable youth. The framework provides a blueprint to address the needs most central to a child's holistic development. A whole child approach to education is defined primarily by policies and practices, what we do and how we support students in school. The framework can help districts and schools think about their policies and practices and the extent to which they create the conditions for students to learn, grow, and succeed. But it's also dependent on partnerships, another key idea from Each Child, Our Future. We know that creating a great future for each child and for every community in our state requires that we all work together. Parents, families, caregivers, they're a child's first teachers and the education community's most trusted partners. The framework calls out parent and family engagement specifically. Other partners are also tremendously important. I often say supporting children is everyone's business, and meeting the needs of the whole child is what that's all about. Engaged partners include healthcare providers, mental health providers, social service organizations, after-school programs, local nonprofits, businesses, faith-based organizations, and many other service providers. Many of them have, as part of their own missions, serving children as a fundamental focal point. Schools serve the essential role in connecting with students on a regular basis, which makes them uniquely positioned to facilitate partners to better reach children. The Whole Child Framework helps to connect and align all this great work. The other key connection to Each Child, Our Future relates to equity. The strategic plan recognizes that a focus on equity for each student is vital for success, and yet it is the most difficult to achieve, as it looks, sounds, and feels different for each child. Equity requires personalization, recognizing each student's assets and talents, and giving each student the resources and supports needed at the proper time to ensure growth and success. The Whole Child Framework gives us another tool to guide the work toward making equity in our education system a reality for all students across Ohio. What is most exciting is that we've already been seeing many districts and schools implementing various aspects of the Whole Child Framework. For example, some schools have created school-based health clinics. Some have incorporated social emotional learning into each classroom experience. And many have utilized positive behavioral interventions and supports to enhance and improve school climate and culture. We'll be featuring examples of best practices from across the state to show people the way and help inspire more activity. I invite you to visit our website at education.ohio.gov/wholechild to view the Whole Child Framework for yourself. There you will find a number of resources and guides to help you on your journey to using the framework and configuring it to meet the needs of your local education community. In addition, we'll also be hosting periodic live and pre-recorded virtual webinars to review the elements of the framework and highlight some great examples from schools and districts across Ohio.
Oops.
The Whole Child Framework is an important bridge between schools, families, and communities. We're excited for the release of the framework itself, but it's just the beginning. I look forward to seeing how more schools and districts customize the framework and use it to create the conditions that support the success of their local learners. As always, feel free to contact us with any questions or suggestions you may have on implementation or ideas for improvement. And we'll be providing more content in the near future. And as always, thank you for what you do each and every day for Ohio's children.
So after seeing that, why don't you write in the chat some things that you might connect with, or that connected with you as you watched him explain what this whole child framework was all about. Like I said, the work of the department has been exceptional, I think, in this area, in terms of how they're embedding it, not only like publicly and talking about it and giving it out, but also how they're embedding it in their work internally. So the whole child framework itself, and you can go to the ODE website to get it, it has defined words in it. One of those words is, what is the concept of equity in education? And so the whole child framework defines that as each child having access to relevant and challenging academic experiences and educational resources necessary for success across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, family background, and or income. So it is about each child having access, having opportunity to get to the outcome of academic experiences and having those ability to achieve, right? So this is the point. And so it also defines, so that's for what is it just in general education, talking about the child, but then it goes on to define what does the system look like. And so again, you have to have that system approach if you really want to solve things. And systems can be schools, it could be districts, it could be the whole thing, right? I mean, it just depends on how you want to look at it. And so an education system that ensures all children can achieve their academic potential despite personal and social circumstances. So a system, right, that is free of barriers, and you have to be able to find those barriers, and most times they're very hidden. And so we have to really have that kind of lens as we're looking at our policies and practices, just like the state superintendent was talking about. How are we creating programs? How are we implementing them? How are we engaging? How are we letting people know about them, right? All of this could have hidden barriers in it. ODE's vision, and you heard him talk about it as he kind of opened, it really, if you know this, it's more than just what happens in the classroom. In fact, honestly, that's probably the least worry at this point, right? Once we get them there, we got them and we can work with them. It's really all those things that kind of happen outside the classroom that really impact what's going on inside. And you heard the superintendent talk about a lot of these things you see on the screen. And so what we know is, being in this field, is that really what we're talking about is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so if we don't have those basic psychological and safety needs met, there is no way our children are going to be able to get up into those higher levels of esteem and self-actualization. And we know that that's where optimal learning is. And so again, the whole child framework is really more than just what is going on academically. It is really about the whole community around the child. So let's talk about kind of culture and the impact of culture on this. So if you noticed in the whole child framework, as it came up on the screen, they have 3 principles, or those 3 core values that I was talking about. And one of them is cultural responsiveness, and the other 2 are coordinated policy and continuous improvement. These are the pathways that ODE has kind of outlined about how to get to equity. And this is in one of the supplemental documents, the whole child framework document, actually, which is a supplement to the strategic plan. So the way that they've defined cultural responsiveness is an approach that respectfully encompasses and recognizes both student and educators' lived experiences, cultures, and language. And you can actually cross out educator and just write any adult touching or in contact with the child, right? So it actually almost doesn't matter if they're the teacher. We know that in education space, lots of people can be teachers, whether or not they're the classroom teacher, right? Any adult that's interacting with students really can be a teacher in some aspects. So it encompasses both the lived experiences of the students and the adults in the building. It's really a superpower. If we can harness this, we can understand it, we can leverage it. So no one comes to school, whether you're a child or an adult, as a blank slate, right? And so being able to really understand that and work through it. Now, remember, culture is more than just what you might have had an implicit bias to do, and that was tie it directly to race and ethnicity. It is more than that. Culture really is just about having a shared set of beliefs, norms, values of a certain group. And we have culture really around everything. So there's different cultures in Ohio depending on where you live. There's different cultures of schools depending on what side of town you're on, right? So that's culture based on geography. There's culture based, in family. There's culture based in activities. So, you have your football parents, your sports parents, or your theater parents, or your theater kids. I mean, there's these, things that tie them together. So pushing and thinking outside of just race or ethnicity or religion, those are the top ones. Thinking a little bit broader might help us. Put in the chat some other types of culture groups that you interact with in your space. Throw some out there so we can kind of get some examples going. So we have culture that's big. And so I want to show you this video now about a school that's using these culturally responsive practices in the way that they are kind of evaluated. Now, this is older kids, obviously, but I want you to also look at it with a critical eye. I'm going to clue you in. I believe there are groups of people that are missing as part of their kind of cohort of grownups in the building. So kind of look at it with a critical eye. And if we really want to have the most culturally responsive practices where we are, using and leveraging all that great diversity that's in our buildings, think about what could be missing. So let's watch this one. And as it's playing, go ahead and chat it up. You can put like some reflections or something that surprised you. Maybe you're doing some of this. Go ahead and chat it up. And then if you, at the end, think about who could be missing as the grown-ups from their kind of circles as they come together to talk about the students.
Adelante, umbral de español, busquen su nombre con su palito, muchas gracias.
There are no blank slates walking into the classroom. Culturally responsive teaching is capitalizing on all that students bring with them from their personal lives and their home lives. And it's really knowing that student, knowing where he or she is from, and using that to craft the most meaningful and rigorous learning opportunities. Here at Amigos, a bilingual school in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we are focused on culturally responsive, joyful education.
To borrow Zaretta Hammond's word, culture responsive practice really is like widening our aperture as adult educators to consider a broader perspective on what strategies can then match with our students' needs if we really want to see more equitable outcomes for our students.
One of the things that we're doing to support that work and our growth as educators are learning walks. Learning walks allow teachers to visit each other's classrooms to see how they are implementing new strategies. We are looking for evidence of equitable student participation, and we're looking to make sure that primarily there's a relationship there, because in order to teach that child, you need to know that child.
We visit the classroom, take notes using our guide.
Tienen un argumento bien fuerte, bien formado. Todos participaron.
We are really looking at what instructional decisions are we making that will support students to have equity of voices, rigor, and consider their different cultures and identities, and really capitalize on that for them to feel safe and authentic and a sense of belonging into our classrooms.
Tessa.
¡Au! Ay, necesitaba evacuar. Hay bombas en todas partes.
I'm really thinking about what are the different ways that one can organize the instruction so there's diversity of access points to this language in the literature, and for the students to be able to feel comfortable sharing what they know, sharing what they don't know.
Como por eso dice hito en hito, como partes de su vida que lo convierten en quien es.
I really thought that one of the strengths was your use of the vocabulary and then giving students the tools they needed to use it themselves.
We come back together for a debrief. We look at questions that may emerge and any recommendations that we've come up with.
Everyone ended up being engaged at some point.
We were struck by the variety and the depth of voice that students were demonstrating in her class. We heard lots of different voices, and that was exciting to see and hear.
We need to make sure that they all feel represented, they all feel safe to do their best learning, they all feel respected. And I think that's a lifelong process for any educator. Culturally responsive teaching isn't something that you say, I went to a professional development session, I'm all set, check the box. It's something you have to dedicate a lot of time to throughout your career to make sure that you're doing the best for the students.
So what are some thoughts and reflections from that? Are you implementing any of those type of practices? And how is it a little bit different maybe for your early education, your little ones, your infants even? How would you incorporate culturally responsiveness in to kind of really, really early education, right? Where the kiddos aren't really talking back to you. This is all work in progress, right? There's really no answers. And in fact, the answer is actually dependent on the child. But you probably are doing some of those things or have thought about it. Now, I asked you at the beginning, who is missing? Who is missing or could be missing? If you think about more of who the child interacts with, if the point of the learning walks and the point is to really understand each child, there might be some people missing. So think about that and put in the chat, who else is part of your education team? Yeah, you're special. So I saw someone write music. Who else is part of your education team that really could have different insight maybe about the student, not just the experience they're having in the classroom, but who else could be part of these kind of learning walks or learning circles or circles around each child, right? So these are all opportunities to really dig in there and start to understand and learn and use culturally responsive practices. And I like what the teacher said near the end, and she said, you can't just go to one training. This is about really trying to embed this in how we work. It takes intentional practice and skills, and it is hard. It's very hard to do. So that's an example of cultural responsiveness. And again, when we talk about why we're using cultural responsiveness, it's because how else do you know how to move the resources if you don't know the kid? If you don't know the child, if you don't know the family, if you don't know what's going on, how do you move the resources in a way that works best for them, right? Or how do you not do things like we've seen historically, where you have a child who is under a lot of stress and pressure at home, not getting what they need outside the classroom, and they come in and they become discipline problems? Like, how do we not use that as a bias point, right? And so again, that's putting up an internal barrier, probably a hidden one because it's implicit. But how do we make sure we're not doing that sort of thing either, even as little kids? Because it starts super early, right? So thinking about that, this is why we use culturally responsive practices in order to figure that out. So here's a few more terms that you probably know already. And Julie's got a lot of people here. I love it. Cafeteria, the custodial, janitorial staff, the principal, the nurse, after school, maybe the bus driver. Yeah, so many more people in your buildings and your kind of educational structures, your instructional aides, your counselors, your secretary. I mean, people interact with families at different points, right? So thinking about it as a bigger circle, how do we pull in more information about each child? So cultural competency, I know you know this word. This has been around for a little while. This idea that there's a continuous learning process and how we build the knowledge around culture. What this does, though, is it really assumes that you can become an expert in culture, that at some point you just know it, and then you can just pull it up and then know that this is what this culture needs and do checkbox, right? And no, we've seen this kind of play out in the health field. And so, that doesn't actually work. You have to kind of more approach it with this idea of cultural humility, that really culture is an ongoing learning process. And so these ideas of competency and humility are coupled together. Cultural humility, this is defined from the Kirwan Institute as well, the ability to maintain interpersonal stance that is other-oriented in relation to aspects of cultural identity. It encourages personal reflection and growth around culture. So we are using that growth mindset. Every opportunity is an opportunity to learn about culture, because culture is so big and broad and so individual that everyone really has a different set of what makes up their culture. So using these two together really is what helps us understand it better. So let's talk a little bit about some of the barriers that might come up in our process to really getting to equity. So I've kind of mentioned a few of them. Let's start with at the individual level. So if you have, hopefully you've taken some sort of implicit or unconscious bias training in the past. So this hopefully is not new information to you, but we know that that is a big barrier. Obviously, every person has their own lens, their own culture, their own expectations about things. And, sometimes we get really caught up in that and we forget that others have different lenses. And so, we all have our own biases. So implicit bias, though, is the type of bias that we actually have no idea that we're using. It is deep in our brains. It is a brain science. It's actually pretty cool if you go and study it a little bit deeper. And what it does is it's where our brains just automatically kind of use these attitudes and stereotypes that we've developed over time. And then it impacts the way that we then understand something, we act, we perceive it, and we don't even know it's happening. We don't know it's happening. It's just something that is it's an automatic pilot in our brains. But what that means is that sometimes when this happens, it then attributes feelings and attitudes, right? And we then start to treat different groups of people differently based on that. And again, we have no clue that we're doing it. And it can be based on things that we see, we perceive right away. So in those split seconds of seeing someone. So as soon as I figured out how to get my camera back on, you saw me and you immediately had a lot of things that you thought about me, right? Including you get to now see my background, which is a little messy. So I was trying to put a background up, but you're taking all of that in, right? And then as we've talked and we've moved through our session, almost 45 minutes in our session, you might have had different or additional things that you have perceived about me. And all of these things are putting together this picture. You don't even know you're doing it. This is just what we do. In fact, you have probably created a whole backstory about me based on what you have perceived and things. You've made assumptions about my gender and my age and all sorts of things. And then I might cue you in and give you a little nugget, I kind of talked a little more about my job or things like that. And then that kind of builds, it keeps building this kind of who is Jen box, right? And again, you don't know that you're doing it. But then you have attitudes and stereotypes about those things. And so, it's something that we all have to work on. It's so important. And we sometimes as individuals become the biggest barrier. So the thing about implicit bias is that everyone has it. It is not explicit bias. So explicit bias is where you are consciously making the choice. You are consciously saying, I am going to treat these people differently because I like them or I don't like them or I have something, right? It's a conscious, you are choosing it, right? When you have implicit bias and kind of where your implicit bias lies, it might not align with who you are. And that's because it generally favors the in-group. And the in-group is generally the group that is the in-group of society. So those that are in the privileged kind of power structure have more privilege or power in society, even if it goes against your own identity. Again, it's unconscious. The way that implicit bias is created is from the moment you are born and who took you to whatever home you had, right? And the things that they gave you and experiences. And then, as you got older, what type of school and the curriculum and your friends and your community. And then as you even got older, choosing maybe where you went to college or making other types of choices, really solidifying what your circles and lenses look like. And then as you become an adult, and you now being in the early education space, you are influencing those young people just like you were influenced, right? So even if we don't mean to, we do, because we are the teachers of the next generation. And so it can be cyclical. And that's why you see communities, and that's why you kind of see why we are where we are as a country right now, because we have communities that just have things embedded in them, right? Because it's cyclical. We're teaching our children, we're incorporating these experiences, we're giving value and feelings to these experiences, and it kind of perpetuates it. So that's why, especially in the education space, we have to be really mindful of what our own biases are and making sure that we are not accidentally putting those onto children. And again, it's all unconscious, and that's what makes it really challenging. So that's that first part of the Peterson's development model, awareness. Are you aware? And so, you can become aware if you go to a Harvard Implicit or Project Implicit. You can take tests that help you kind of identify where your implicit bias is. And that's the first step, really. And then you just become more aware of it and try to pull yourself out of that unconscious thinking as you're kind of working in that group. We actually have done some really fun classes after people take it, where you kind of dig in to figure out, why did I have that result? And it's really interesting. People reflect on their childhood. They reflect on who was there and the experiences they had to kind of say, what, it kind of makes sense now why I have that. Because thinking back to the way that I was raised, or what I was exposed to, it does make sense. And so it's really interesting as we kind of dig through those in a psychologically safe way. Implicit bias in that way that I just explained can be unlearned or relearned, because it was something that is learned. And it started off at a very early age, but with intentional practice and having the awareness and the knowledge, it is something that we can work on. But it is hard, because our brains want to go back to that automatically, because it is just the easiest thing. So implicit bias creates blind spots. I mentioned that, I think, at the very beginning of the training really quick. So what is it? It's just a lens we can't see because we don't have awareness of it, because we have no experience or exposure to it. But it doesn't mean that, it doesn't exist. And so then when it comes up to you and you say, so you don't want to say, oh no, I don't know what that is. So that doesn't exist. I don't have that experience. I don't relate to that experience. That creates what we'll talk about in a second, a microaggression. So it's just spaces you can't see because you literally don't know. Your brain, you just don't know it exists. And so this is that awareness building. And that's why, in professional development, in spaces around your profession, talking about your kids, understanding their families, talking about culture, talking about your own experiences and those with your colleagues. This is what opens the awareness. This is what opens, your eyes. And then being okay with that and saying, what, I can't possibly know everything, right? And I only have my lenses, and that's fine, but it's also pretty cool to learn about others. And so having, again, that right mindset. And that really helps us get through the blind spots. Your kids have them too, by the way, even little ones. They're developing them. So think about that. And this is that idea of cultural responsiveness. So you have them, they have it, their families have it. It's all this kind of figuring it out together and really, being a safe space to do so in the classroom, no matter what age. So microaggressions, this is Dr. Darwin Sue, and he and his team coined the term microaggression. I'm not going to read that definition to you. It's very, very academic, which I know you all can read because you are very smart. But I'm going to show it to you kind of in a breakdown. So microaggressions happen every day. And basically, it's your implicit bias sneaking out. Most of the microaggressions are very, unintentional. There's different levels of them. So we're not going to go in that today. But if they happen at various levels and have different impacts to them. But most of them are completely unintentional, right? They can be verbal, so saying it, nonverbal, action. Environmental, what's around you. So think about how we set up rooms, and think about in early education, that is exactly what our like little ones are. It's the visuals, right? It's the environment that they're in. And so thinking about what types of posters you're hanging up, who's in the posters, what are they seeing? What kind of picture books are you showing them? What kind of materials? And this goes, into whatever curriculum you're using. Is it represented, right? Does it actually, are we accidentally sending signals to them that somehow make them feel othered? And that's the impact of microaggressions. So they are these slight snubs, insults, that are like, they're small, but over time they build up. Now I'm going to ask each of you, because all of you have a microaggression that hits you. Microaggressions can trigger on any of your variety. So not just your race or gender. I mean, those are big ones, but they can be where you're from. They can be your accent. They can be your body size. They can be if your family status. They can be your profession. There's so many things that microaggressions can trigger on. So think about that. What's that one question that like strangers always ask you, where they have like some weird comment, or, it's always like one thing, right? And so what this feels like. You might not have thought about it in this way before, but what it feels like, because it feels to you like someone has saying to you, you don't belong, or something's wrong with you, or right. It's that othering feeling. And that's what microaggressions do. So they can be intentional or unintentional, but they're always unconscious. And intentional just means like if you, sometimes we know the words are coming out, but we just don't quite understand, because it might be some sort of vernacular that we use, or some saying that we use that's just, historical. So for example, if someone wants to say, oh, someone is really tight with their money and they don't want to pay full price. I've heard people say, oh, don't Jew me, right? Because there is some like historical context around like, Jewish individuals being tight with money. And so that is definitely a microaggression. It is one, if I say it, I intend to say it. I just might not understand or have knowledge and awareness of what the historical context is, and what it actually means when I say it. It isn't just something, right? That's so gay, right? So things like, these things that we just say. Actually, I probably did it in this saying, hey guys, that is a microaggression against females or individuals, who have different gender identity. And so, we say these things, and so that's intentional. I say it, but I don't mean it, and I don't fully understand or might not understand the context. So think about how that kind of works, and especially talking and helping little ones learn. And again, it's that feeling that they're create in the person. It's not intended. The person saying it doesn't intend it. It's all about the impact. And so, the impact to that person is it's negative, it's derogatory, it's hostile, it others them. And again, these are learned from a very early age. They start at a very early age. Think about that one thing I asked you to think about. What's that one question you get? And if it somehow centers around something that people perceive about when they see you, think about how early that started for you, right? So this happens to everyone. And typically they are based on a marginalized group. So if we go back to the idea of societal privilege and power, it's going to be a status that would be considered underprivileged or marginalized. And to be fair, most of you have one. Okay, because there's so many groups of society. And if you look at the structure across all of those, whether that be age or religion or economic status, or, all of those have this idea of what would be privileged and underprivileged. And so we are multidimensional. And so we fall in marginalized groups, all of you do, somewhere in your kind of variety, right? It just depends on sometimes how they're stacked together, and which ones kind of are stronger if you have an overall marginalized group status or not. So it's kind of an interesting thought to think through, and then think through how that impacts when you're talking to your students. So how do we stop this? What do we do? The first thing is, again, that awareness. And for you as an individual, it's that awareness of yourself. So think about becoming a little detective for yourself. Think about, as you're interacting with people, looking for patterns, being honest with yourself and building your own awareness. So if you just realize that, oh my gosh, every time I talk to someone who I perceive as being older than 60, I get this weird reaction, right? Maybe I have some bias around age. I'm going to watch myself on that. I might go take a test, a Harvard test on age bias, right? So thinking about that and building your own awareness to that. Education and exposure. So again, you can go take the Harvard Implicit Bias. That's the most well-known, most researched kind of assessment. And then once be curious, go learn, expose yourself to the things that you thought that you found that you have a bias in. And then it takes intentional practice and having the right mindset and acting with humility as you move forward in this space. So for example, if you find out that you have some sort of bias against individuals that, let's say, wear hijabs, right? And maybe you are working with a family whose children or the women in the family wear them. I mean, you're curious and you want to know more about it. Well, first research, right? But then you might want to have a conversation with that family and, find out more about them, or, why is it that the young girls wear them when, most likely they don't have to until they hit puberty. I mean, there's reasons for the choices that are made in those circumstances. So being curious and acting with humility and always with that growth mindset, keeping that psychologically safe space as you explore for you and others involved. So here's the link to the implicit association test. You can also just Google it. It's just Project Implicit. They have so many tests out there. They're constantly researching. So they are, putting different ones out there. The ones around, I think, race and gender are pretty typical, but they'll flip other ones in and out or add ones to it. So it's always interesting when you take it. Now, I will give you one caveat. When you take it, don't freak out if you get that you do have a bias. Remember, this doesn't mean that you are an ist, right? Or you have isms. That's not at all what this means. This is what's happening unconsciously in your mind. What in your past experiences are connecting dots. That's all it is. It's an awareness building tool. And so you will have some. You might have some that surprise you, that actually align with your own identity. So you have them against things that you believe in. And so, it is more about like an awareness learning thing than to make you feel bad. So explore that with curiosity, and kind of start with maybe a test that you find more maybe interesting or maybe less difficult. So maybe not jump into a race one if that one might make you a little nervous. All right, I want to move into systems now. So we learned we learned about the concept of educational systems and what equity looks like there. I want to talk about, because, obviously we're still in COVID, I want to talk about social determinants of health and how education falls in more of a bigger system. So right now, in the state of Ohio, all of our agencies, including Department of Education, including higher ed, are looking at how do we actually influence the health system. And so we are looking at our institutional bias, which I've already defined for you. But really what we're doing now is looking across government to figure out how is all of government either contributing or not contributing to solving, this issue of health disparity that we kind of knew about before, right? We did know, but that COVID really exposed. And we know it's not just race. I mean, race is a trigger, but also more importantly, it's geographic location. Where people live is really the thing that's triggering. And that's the same thing kind of in the education space, right? So you might have seen this before. These are the social determinants of health that come from the Kaiser Family Foundation. And we know that the more unstable these are for an individual, the more likely they have negative health outcomes. Okay. So if they have unemployment, or they have a lot of debt, or they don't have stable housing, or they don't have access to early childhood education, we know that in the end, they are going to be unhealthier or less healthy people, right? Which then causes problems and disparity. And so thinking about us as a bigger kind of, idea as a system, it's early education is right there. And so, thinking about how we all kind of work together. So our systems have barriers, and I'm using, social determinants as an example. And so thinking about how do we interact with our partners? How do we, how are we doing this across the system to really identify what could be impacting our students? I will tell you, in an education space, you are doing this, and you had to because you figured it out. You're bringing in community partners, you're bringing in health organizations, you're bringing in families, you're trying to make these connections because you had to, right? No one else was doing it. And you're like, these kids need something. And so, trying to do it in kind of this way. And it's really about how do we do it in a more coordinated way? How do we, as, a bigger system, work together to really identify and address some of these barriers? So this is like more of the societal social determinants of health. We also have school determinants of health. So this is more structured to what's going on inside of educational spaces. And so this is something that in 2013, a group of researchers put together, and they did a white paper on, and the citation is there if you want, when you get the slides, if you're interested, pretty short, if you want to read it. But basically what they did was just like the social determinants of health, they went ahead and put kind of what's going on around the school, and they put it in different kind of boxes. So we have the physical structures of the buildings, right? So the place that we come and what does the environment look like? Our health policies. So the policies that we have around health practices as well as health education, the programs, resources, school climate, and then the demographics or composition of the school. So physical and structural environment are the activity spaces, the physical spaces, air quality. That's a huge one right now, isn't it? Right now with COVID, air quality, anything that's hazardous around or in the school. Are you in a rural or urban location, suburban location? So the actual place that your building is. And if you guys have reaction to this, I'd love to see some comments pop up. If you haven't thought about this, or you're like, yeah, that's right on. I totally get that. Your health policies. So here in Ohio, especially, as we go up, we don't really have standardized health standards from ODE, right? That's something that individual school districts decide. So big things around, if you really think about the social determinants of health, and especially the social determinants like early pregnancy or, things like that, we don't always standardly teach. We don't teach some of those things, across the state. So it's left up to local control about how their students are taught. And so that's kind of a disadvantage if we're talking about a health system or a system where everyone has level setting information, because that's actually not happening. And that's a policy decision. And so the way that is structured as a system in Ohio, and then how buildings or districts or programs are choosing what type of health education to give students, right? We have our programs. So what's actually going on? So we have our food programs, our physical ed, our social emotional, our prevention, but not everyone has all access to all those, right? And so again, that can cause inequity. What type of resources or opportunities or exposure do we have? And then again, the health resources that are more like health resources in the community that we kind of partner with, nurses. Do you have nurses? Even in those pre-K, childcare spaces, do you have access to nurses? Do you have mental health services? Do you have links to your community health? Some do, some don't, but this is what creates inequities, right? School climate, what's going on? What are the relationships like in the building? You heard the superintendent talk about that in the building. The relationships between the grownups and the students, and the students and the families and the schools and the communities and the schools. And it's so important that we have these climates that are psychologically safe and support learning. And it's more than what happens in the classroom, right? It's so much more. And then we have our composition. So then kind of looking at, again, things that we know that are happening on the outside in terms of demographics. So your zip code is a big determinant, right? Where you live, what's your student population? Are you mostly a minority district or school or program? Funding. Are you getting more federal funding versus, it's these like outside things. So again, we can look at the school space in terms of these structural policy type of decisions. And we can see that we do have some hidden inequities. We do have some things here that, we are contributing to the poor health of students, because not all of our students have access to these things, or not all of our buildings are, in the best condition. And that's not our fault. There's so much going on in school, like why that is, right? But it's coming to those awareness points and then trying to figure out how to do it. But if we don't have healthy and safe communities, then we can't then impact the bigger structure of, what does it look like for helping with social determinants of health. So you also know, I know you know about ACEs, you know about those. So I wanted to play just the first few minutes of this video for you, where this pediatrician is talking about the traditional ACEs, but then also linking in kind of what we've just gone through about social determinants and kind of what's happening on the outside, and kind of thinking about it a different way than just those individual trauma points. It's more also community trauma points. So I'm just going to play the first maybe few minutes of this video for you, and I'll kind of weirdly abruptly stop it. So know that that's intentional.
And so we have listed here the adverse childhood experiences that are well recognized from studies over the last couple decades. We commonly group adverse childhood experiences into abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. So those were the 10 original ACEs that Dr. Folletti and Dr. Onda studied back in the mid-90s, and began to develop this data around ACEs. But what we've begun learning is there's a whole nother layer of ACEs as well. And so we've begun to think about this as a pair of ACEs. And so you can see, not only do we have adverse childhood experiences, but we also have adverse community environments that many of our children face, especially here in Memphis. I'm sure there's similar in Houston and for many of the communities where you are from as well. So when we think about layering all of the experiences and stresses that our children go through, and then adding in things like poverty, discrimination, racism, poor housing stock, community violence, these things really interplay to affect the health and well-being of children in the future. So this is kind of the groundwork of what we know affects children in the ways that we'll talk about here in a minute. Next slide.
So you have the link is in here if you'd like to finish watching that. Once you get the slides, you'll be able to. But so you heard that these things impact our students, and what we know is, again, it's systems that are doing this to our students, creating kind of opportunities for this inequity. So again, it's a system kind of look, and we kind of have to figure out, what do we do? What do we do with that? So it isn't just those things that are happening at the individual level, which is also important to look at, but this acknowledgement that the systems are impacting our certain groups of our students and families in a way that's just setting it up for inequity, right? So that individual ACEs, and then what we are looking at more in those community ACEs as well. So let's talk about, how do we implement cultural responsiveness? So this is what all this was kind of built towards, right? So we've figured out what it is. We figured out that sometimes we are a barrier to it. Our systems are a barrier to it. But how do we actually start to maybe think about putting it into practice? So here's just a little sneak peek about how to do that. First, we have to figure out, are we aware of the culture and the cultural disparity? So is there something going on? Awareness, right? It's the first step in the model. Then what we want to know is, do I know why? Why does this disparity exist? Right? Do we have data? Do we know the cause of it? If we don't, how do we figure that out? So then you're asking yourself, what is my knowledge of the culture? And again, remember, culture is bigger than just race and ethnicity. I say that it can be so many more things. But what is my knowledge about the culture? And then how do I know that knowledge is factual knowledge? Am I using some kind of bias? So then you have to kind of think about it from yourself, right? Is it something that I actually know? Is it something I have firsthand knowledge of? Or do I need to, and if it is, okay, but if not, what additional information am I going to need, right? How do I gain this additional information about the culture? And then thinking about what tools, skills, resources, people, how do I actually go do it? So acknowledgement that I need it, and then how do I do it? And so the answers are not quick, right? It's not quick. Cultural responsiveness is intentional. It takes time. It takes strategy. It's really about digging in and trying to figure out the people that you are serving, the kiddos, the families, the communities, and then also yourself. So that's kind of self-reflection as well. Okay, as we close up, I just want to kind of talk about a few more concepts and kind of bringing this together. So we kind of talked about this idea of, we had a lot in here. I threw in privilege and power. We talked about different dimensions of diversity. But here's the thing. All of our dimensions and the way that they come together is very unique for everyone. So I know some of you have heard this term intersectionality before, but it's the way that our dimensions and variety come together, and everyone has a different way that happens. And so we cannot make assumptions just because we know we perceive someone as looking like us or being like us. Even then, we have different ways that our dimensions intertwine. So this appreciation that the way that happens for everyone gives everyone a very unique lens and a way of looking at it. And everyone's perspective is valuable and important, especially as we move through to try to find solutions to issues of equity, right? Or inequity, I should say, and really trying to help our students. And I want to lastly show you the dimensions of diversity because I've mentioned it a few times. And this is a tool that we use with our agencies just to kind of explain that it's more than just race or ethnicity. So the personality dimension is that thing that makes you you. It's all the way that you personally approach problems. It's your personal expectations. It's all that is you, right? Inside your mind, how it works. The internal ring is the ring, and you can see that's where I think a lot of the EEO categories are. These are a lot of places that either society has given us a box to go into, or things that people immediately perceive and make some sort of judgment about. This is a lot where our implicit bias lives, these trigger points really quickly. The blue ring is things that we have a tiny bit more choice about. And, we can also have implicit bias about this too, but we have a little more choice in this ring. The green ring, we don't have very much choice in it all. And so we have a little more choice in the blue ring. I would suggest that the blue ring is actually more powerful to us. If we can dig into those things, it provides a much deeper level of variety to tap into and strategically include and understand about yourself and your students. And then lastly, the red ring. And we have to talk about that because we are part of organizations. We are part of systems. We're part of, doing and being part of a mission. And within our organizations, we have institutional bias and our own implicit bias about how those things should work. So things about your location of where your office school program is, what you do in it. There's always some sort of hierarchy in an organization, whether it's the org chart or not, right? That we kind of like put in there. Union affiliation versus not. What are you doing? What is the content, your field of practice or study? All of these things have bias associated with them. All of these places are opportunity to really explore culture and what it means. And all of it together can be your superpower to really start to move the needle on examining, and especially in our school spaces, what is it that not only you need, but your students need, and how do we create that, really looking at the whole child. So that's where I have saved a little room for questions or comments. I know it was fast. I know it was a ton of information. I hope that at least something sparked your curiosity, that you learned something new today, that something that you can, at least one thing that you can take and put back into practice. This is such an important topic right now in the way that we are really addressing education in Ohio. It is something that is so important to our students starting in those early education spaces when they're the fastest learners, right? And so I want to thank you for all your work in this space, and thank you for you becoming practitioners of cultural responsiveness and really keeping our students center. So thank you, and I can take questions, Judith, if that's appropriate.
Absolutely. And definitely, folks, go ahead and use the Q&A or the chat to be able to ask Jennifer questions or add thoughts from the session today. I just appreciate your thoughts, Jennifer, and the session, because as far as understanding more about what our state's priorities and strategies are around equity and justice was quite helpful. And then that there are just so many connections that I see, even within our early childhood field, and as we connect to other systems in the education continuum. So I just, there's just my mind is spinning with so many ideas. It's amazing.
It is. And that's, it's hard because we kind of operate in silos. We've been doing it for so long, but we really are truly interconnected. And that, like looking at that social determinant of health thing, even though it's about health, it is really about all of us, because you can turn that whole thing around and put education at the top. And you can see how each of those are impacted, how all the other systems impact education. And so it is this acknowledgement that we kind of really need to think about this and do it better so that we can have better outcomes for our students.
Absolutely.
Well, if you all do have questions later, Judith knows how to find me. I am always happy to continue to share information, and you have my slides. So let us know how we can help you and continue to support you on your journey.